Hello, I'm Sylvia Yount, the Lawrence A. Fleischman Curator in charge of the American Wing, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this MetSpeaks program planned in conjunction with the exhibition Winslow Homer Cross Currents. The inspiration for this dialogue is the Gulfstream, both the place, the powerful Atlantic Ocean current, and the artistic subject, as imagined by Homer and others. And we're excited to hear the diverse perspectives of an art historian, cultural historian, poet, and visual artist on the topic. I'm privileged to have co-curated the Homer exhibition with my Met colleague, Stephanie Herdrich, Associate Curator of American Painting and Sculpture, who will moderate this conversation. Our project evolved from a focused look at the artist's Caribbean production to a more expansive survey that explores his work across the Atlantic world through the lens of conflict, grounded in issues of race and the environment, the core theme of his epic turn of the 20th century painting, The Gulfstream. Homer famously wrote of the work, arguably his most consequential and challenging, that he regretted he painted a picture that, quote, requires any description. But we celebrate its interpretive complexity and hope this program will encourage you all to think about the canvas, as well as the famously elusive artist, in fresh ways. Now I'm happy to turn things over to Stephanie, who will share an overview of the topic and introduce the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. I'm so delighted to be here this afternoon with you and with our guests. I'd like to start by introducing our speakers this afternoon, and then I'll do the overview of the show and the themes of the conversation. I wanted to start with Ada Ferrer. She is Julius Silver Professor of History and Latin American and Caribbean Studies at New York University, where she has taught since 1995. She is the author of several award-winning books on Cuba. Insurgent Cuba, Race, Nation, and Revolution, 1868 to 1898, was a history of the Cuban independence movement against Spain and the central role of slavery and race in its unfolding. That book won the 2000 Berkshire Book Prize for the best first book by a woman in any field of history. Her second book, Freedom's Mirror, Cuba and Haiti in the Age of Revolution, explored the pivotal role of the Haitian Revolution in Cuba. It won the Frederick Douglass Prize from the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale University, as well as multiple prizes from the American Historical Association. Her most recent book, Cuba, An American History, was published last year. It is a sweeping history of more than 500 years of Cuban history and its entanglement with the history of the United States. It is a beautifully written book and a pleasure to read. Professor Ferrer was born in Cuba, came to the United States as a baby, and the book draws from her personal history, including more than 30 years of travel to and research on the island. Cuba, An American History was recently awarded the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and the Pulitzer Prize, and we offer our congratulations on those awards and a welcome to you. Bernard Ferguson is a Bahamian poet, essayist, and MFA candidate at New York University. Bernard is currently working on a book of nonfiction entitled The Climate Sirens, which is expected in 2023. It is about Hurricane Dorian and the effects of climate change on small island developing states across the world. These days, they are thinking mostly about wonder, climate, trauma, migrations of all kind, and Bahamian Caribbean history. Bernard is the winner of multiple writing and poetry prizes, including the 2019 Hurston Wright College Writers Award and the Cincinnati Review's 2019 Robert and Adele Schiff Poetry Prize, among others. Bernard has served as assistant editor at Washington Square Review and has received fellowships, numerous fellowships. Their writing has been featured, published, or is forthcoming in the National Gallery of Art of the Bahamas, the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, Vice News, the Paris Review, among other publications. Thank you for joining us, Bernard. And last but not least, Hugh Hayden is an artist working in New York City. His practice considers the anthropomorphization of the natural world as a visceral lens for exploring the human condition. Hayden transforms familiar objects through a process of selection, carving, and juxtaposition to challenge perceptions of ourselves, others, and the environment. Raised in Texas and trained as an architect, his work arises from a deep connection to nature and its organic materials. Hayden utilizes wood as his primary medium, frequently loaded with multi-layered histories in their origin, including objects as varied as discarded trunks, rare indigenous timbers, Christmas trees, or souvenir African sculptures. Crafting metaphors for human existence and past experience, Hayden's work questions the stasis of social dynamics and asks the viewer to examine their place in an ever-shifting ecosystem. I look forward to speaking with all of you and to our conversation together in a moment, but I wanted to start by speaking about the works at the center of our conversation today, and specifically Homer's painting of the Gulfstream. This is a painting that was inspired by Homer's trips to the Bahamas in 1884, 85, and 1898, 99, but draws on interests and themes that he cultivated across his career: race, nature, the environment. Across his art, of course, Homer also painted the theme of conflict, beginning with the US Civil War. He looked at the impact of the war on the environment and people. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, his art explored humankind's often fraught relationship with nature. He became preoccupied with the power and the threat of nature, painting images of New England and North Atlantic fisher folks, powerful storms at sea, among other subjects. And his painting, The Gulfstream, is in many ways the culmination of these themes. Painted in 1899, in the last decades of his life, but he continued to work on it until 1906. And this epic scene of distress has been interpreted in diverse ways across the last century, as Sylvia noted. Of course, this focus on the unrelenting power of nature and the layering of symbolism in this painting that points to the history and legacy of slavery, centering on a Black protagonist, prominently displayed sugarcane stalks on the deck of the boat, and sharks, a powerful symbol of the Middle Passage. And yet Homer insisted that the subject of this picture was comprised in its title, the Gulfstream, emphasizing this mighty ocean current that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico along the eastern seaboard of the United States and across the ocean to England. Homer celebrates the power of nature, but we can't ignore these geopolitical implications and the role of the Gulfstream current across the centuries in colonization and empire, in the triangle trade, slavery. It's a complicated and consequential painting that's laden with this symbolism, and it continues to speak to us in diverse ways. Its meaning is amplified when paired with this painting, Homer's only other oil painting done in the Caribbean. This is Searchlight on Harbor, Santiago de Cuba, completed in 1901 and 1902. And it's based on his only trip to Cuba in 1885. The painting symbolizes or represents Homer's interpretation of the Spanish-American War, and that is the blockade of the Spanish fleet in Santiago Harbor. Here, this conflict between Spain and the United States and Cuba is represented by Spain prominently on this old Spanish fortification, Morro Castle, that overlooks the harbor, and this antiquated cannon, and the United States represented by the effects of the powerful searchlight, which we see in the background. And this was the technology that the US Navy used to keep the Spanish fleet blockaded in Santiago Harbor. And Cuba is only represented in a small sliver of land at the very right edge of the canvas. Homer is speaking to the moment in the years following this conflict and representing it for his American audiences, speaking to these powerful themes of empire, colonization at an important historical moment. And so we're thinking about the ways that these two paintings embody these complex themes and topics. And all of our speakers today have interest in the subject. And I would like to start with Ada, as a historian and an expert on Cuba and the United States, thinking about how you see Homer's paintings and speaking to the historical moment that he does these compositions. I'm hoping you can give us a broader context for this era and speaking to the US's involvement in the Caribbean and the West Indies and their relationship to Cuba. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for that introduction and that great framing. I think a lot of people don't realize today how present Cuba was in the American imagination over the course of the 19th century. And of course, Winslow Homer was of that world. So for him, Cuba and the Caribbean was something very present in U.S. life. So American leaders, U.S. leaders going back, say, to the time of Jefferson in the 1780s, had imagined Cuba as a kind of natural appendage to the U.S. They thought that it was destined by nature, by geography, by history to become a part of the North American Republic. And then a little bit later, at mid-century, that conviction became even stronger. And many believed that just as Texas had become part of the U.S., that Cuba would be next. And Southerners in particular hoped that Cuba could be incorporated into the Union as two or three or even four new slave states. We know, of course, that didn't happen. Slavery in the U.S. ended as a result of the Civil War before that annexation could happen. But by the time Winslow Homer was traveling to the Caribbean and to Cuba, Cuba was still very much on American minds. In 1868, Cubans had launched the first full-fledged independence war against Spain. And 10 years later, in 1878, that effort was defeated. That means that Homer arrived at eastern Cuba in 1885, and he arrived in eastern Cuba, precisely the place where much of that war was fought. So he would have seen the physical remains of the war, and he would have heard not only about the conflict itself, but about Cubans' continued efforts to end Spanish rule on the island. So what did Homer make of all this? It's hard to say. Traveling to Cuba in the 1880s, in a period between the wars of independence, at a time when Cuba's national question was foremost in people's minds, and when on the island, in his own words, in Homer's own words, the island was, quote, a red-hot place full of soldiers. I looked for the first time, I had never seen the painting before, of the customs house that he drew in 1885. And you can see in that painting these, women up on the balcony with their fans. You see a long Spanish flag hanging from the building. There's soldiers everywhere. But behind one group of soldiers in the painting, there are these other splashes of color. They're blue, reddish, white, that almost suggest a different flag, maybe the Cuban flag. Maybe he was alluding to that sentiment and that reality on the island at the time. But of course, we don't really know. Over the years that followed, actually really over 30 years, between 1868 and 1898, Cubans launched 3 separate independence wars against Spain. They founded political parties, they wrote, they organized, they raised funds to support those efforts. And they actually did a lot of that work in the United States, in cities such as New York, Tampa, Key West, for instance. And the final Cuban War of Independence began on February 24th, 1895, which would have been Winslow Homer's 59th birthday. Americans who were long interested in the fate of Cuba, they watched those events closely. And actually in the first 3 months of that last war, that began in February 1895, Cuba made the front pages of US newspapers at least 7,000 times. So like all Americans, Winslow Homer would have kept abreast of all that news coming from Cuba. That the defeat of Spain happened at the hands of the US had long-standing implications for the history of the island. In the short run, it meant that the US remained in Cuba as a military government of occupation. So when the Spanish flag came down on January 1st, 1899, after more than 400 years, American soldiers raised in its place the American flag. And with that, they inaugurated a period of direct and indirect intervention by the US in Cuban affairs. And the effects of that we feel actually very much to this day. So, I wonder what Homer made of all this, because as Stephanie, as you mentioned, he traveled to Cuba just once in 1885. But he returns to some of that work he did in Cuba precisely in this period of the immediate aftermath of the Spanish-American War and the early U.S. occupation of Cuba. And so at the time, there was all kinds of debate happening, obviously, in Cuba about what the fate of the island was going to be and whether the Americans were going to leave. But, Americans debated those same questions as well. They wondered, is the U.S. now an imperial colonial power like Europe? Uh, will the U.S. leave? What will be the fate of Cuban sovereignty? Will the U.S. annex Cuba? Those were all hotly debated questions at the time, and it's in that moment that that Homer returns to that earlier work he had done on the island. And I wonder if maybe reworking some of that material was his way of thinking through and reflecting on those pressing issues. If it was, and if he was doing that, it's hard to say, what his conclusion, what conclusions he drew. So, I looked at those questions at those two paintings, Stephanie, that you mentioned, the searchlight on harbor entrance in Santiago de Cuba. And as you note, the painting shows the cannons of the fortress of San Pedro, sometimes called El Morro, and the cannons are overlooking the harbor. And the harbor is illuminated by a powerful searchlight coming from an American vessel. So you have the clear contrast that he's drawing between the Spanish cannon that seems almost quaint, like a tourist attraction, harkening back to an earlier age of pirates, say. And you have, in contrasting with that, you have the electrical light illuminating the scene. Modernity, efficiency, symbolizing the modernity and efficiency of a new imperial power in the region, which is the United States. So in that contrast between Spain and the U.S., it's almost, as you mentioned, as if Cuba disappears. You can barely see it, almost like the name of the conflict itself, right? Where the War of Independence became the Spanish-American War and Cuba kind of disappeared from it. You almost see the same thing happening before your eyes in the painting. Except that, as you mentioned, there's a little bit of Cuban land that appears rising from the water on the right-hand side of the painting. And it almost looks as if the Spanish cannon is pointing at the land, ready to fire. And like it's the American searchlight that is illuminating the land, almost as if to help in that attack. So, maybe we can think of the painting as suggesting not just a battle between US and Spain as old and new powers over Cuba, but maybe we can see Cuba here that Cuba is at once almost invisible, or else visible, but only as a target of both external powers. So he seems to be pointing at a contrast, but maybe also at a continuity in between the two sources of power. And I think you can almost say the same thing about the other painting, the Gulfstream. And as you know, the Gulfstream gathers, just north of Havana in the Gulf of Mexico, and then proceeds between the northern coast of Cuba up towards the Bahamas and up along the eastern seaboard and across the Atlantic to Europe. So it connects land masses and sea passages, and it's vital to the history of the whole region and of the individual societies that sit along it. So the image feels timeless, I would say, hard to place historically. There's sugarcane on the ship, as you mentioned, but sugarcane has a centuries-long history in the Caribbean. You have the presence of a Black man on the ship, but the presence of Black men on ships, whether as sailors or as captives, likewise might be an image from the 19th century or from the 16th. It could be any of those. You have the threat of the storm or of the school of sharks, perhaps symbolizing the slaves trade. I understand from the catalog, and I hadn't realized this before, that Homer added the ship on the horizon later as to suggest the possibility of a rescue. Apparently, viewers had wanted to know what happened to the man on the ship. And Homer explained that the man would, quote, be returned to his friends and home and ever after live happily, end quote. But looking at the picture, though, I wonder, as a historian of slavery and the slave trade, I can't help but remark that a large clipper on the horizon did not automatically represent rescue to Black men and women.
Yeah, sorry, I want to jump in there and agree with you. I mean, I think that's very much the point that, he's kind of playing with us in a sense, right? By adding a boat, we don't know what will happen, and this sense of ambiguity and the timelessness that you mentioned is something that I wanted to also bring Bernard in at this point, and I'm going to come back to a bunch of those points in a moment. Ada, I wanted to bring Bernard in when we speak about the timelessness of the scene, right? That it's at once of its moment, speaking to this time around 1900, which was often referred to as the nadir of race relations in the United States. But this painting also speaks to us in the current moment. And as a Bahamian, Bernard, you see really current resonances in this painting. And of course, Homer's always had an interest, aside from all these associations with history and slavery in the Middle Passage, Homer's always had an interest in weather and climate and its impact on humans, and particularly this kind of relentless power of nature. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and your perspective on this as a Bahamian thinking about climate in particular.
Yeah, thanks so much. This painting, specifically the Gulfstream, is really fascinating to me for a number of reasons, but I'll focus on just a couple here in this brief opening. If we look at it literally, it can be interpreted quite literally. Like Homer is in the Bahamas, he's engaging with Bahamians on his visit. He's engaging with somewhat recently emancipated slaves. And Bahamas is not, as a country, the Bahamas is not not on the horizon yet. We don't get independence until about like 1970s. But it's in this state where Black Bahamians, Black emancipated slaves, are still in this somewhat oppressed state, right? And this could be seen quite literally. Homer witnessed something like this maybe when he's in the Bahamas. He's having conversations with Bahamians who are engaging with like maritime labor. So this kind of like a Black person lost in a storm could have literally happened. And then concentrically, we could also see this as metaphor. There's this Black figure on a ship in a storm, and it seems to me that Homer is trying to say the storm is similar to the effects of colonization, that there's a metaphor happening that colonization is also like a storm. And I think that is the interpretive level that I think we largely engage with the painting, and I think that's like really expansive and really exciting to me. But coming to this painting now as a Bahamian in the present, 100 years after this painting was last edited, I see this painting as a pretty well calibrated explanation for the Bahamians' location in the climate crisis. And so we have a kind of, where once it was, this painting could seem as metaphor, like colonization is like a storm, it becomes quite literal, where colonization is causing these storms to get worse, causing these storms to become more frequent. That's the dynamic of the climate crisis. And to me, it seems as though like Homer has this awareness that he's touching on something larger than what we can immediately see in the painting. There's this, I know from the catalog and your essay, Stephanie, there's this gesturing toward Homer gesturing toward this like divine hand on his life, a divine hand on the work that he was engaging with around the time. I think it was a letter to his brother, and it was dated around the time of this painting. And so to me, that's really fascinating. That's really like quite mind-blowing to look back on this painting, to see this really extremely like super well calibrated way of looking at the crisis, right? There is, if you think about the climate crisis as this crisis of societies that are structured around fossil fuels, and how those greenhouse gases then are emitted into the atmosphere, causing the tropics to warm, causing the storms to get worse. That is the same dynamic by which this stranded African finds himself stranded in this ocean is because of colonization and slavery that he finds himself there. It's also because of colonization and slavery that we as Bahamians find ourselves in the Caribbean on an island, right? We have this like wonderful history book that has it uses the painting as framing, um, that this deals with our history from Aboriginal times up until the emancipation of slavery. And so we had throughout history, we've had this understanding of the painting, and now it seems to be evolving. It seems to be holding up through the test of time as we look at it through different modes of through different shifting contexts. As we move through this climate crisis, I see in this painting a well calibrated way of understanding the crisis.
I think that's something that's been so amazing about Homer's art, and we continue to learn about it in these ways, is that how people bring their own histories to this painting and the multivalent ways of reading it. And I think that's some of the brilliance of Homer's art. And in this ambiguity that he creates, which can be very frustrating for us, there's just all of this space for meaning and sentiment and message, which I think you so rightly point to. Let's bring Hugh in for a moment now too, and we're thinking about the Gulfstream and its role in colonization. We talk about its role in Cuba and trade and strengthening Spain during colonization. Hugh, you come to the Gulfstream specifically through contemporary art, thinking of Kerry James Marshall. But what does the Gulfstream mean to you in your art? And, we'd love to hear you speak about how it expresses itself in your work.
Thanks for this introduction, Stephanie. And it's curious looking at the painting during this conversation and thinking if it was actually like a contemporary image. In terms of because technically, except for the clipper ship, that could be a scene today, because the boat design hasn't really evolved that much for this type of boat. But nevertheless, I've seen this painting somewhat as a metaphor in terms of what it could stand for, because slavery. This is post-slavery because this is a man on a sailing boat out by himself. But nevertheless, I chose to look at it somewhat more optimistically in terms of what the painting means, and sort of this idea of the Gulf Stream and as a sort of at the mercy of nature and this sort of perilous scenario, the boat as a vessel for transporting someone, whether they're captive or if they're controlling the boat. In this case, the mast is broken, so therefore there's little control of one's destiny. And also, coming to this to the Winslow Homer's Gulfstream via first seeing Kerry James Marshall's response, which depicts several Black folks sort of with afros that are sort of yachting or sailing, having, you could say, a good time relative to the Homer painting. And coming significantly later, I thought this was an interesting sort of recontextualization and sort of how times have changed, and maybe it's an update on where things are at. However, everything isn't hunky dory, and so in terms of for myself, sort of reinterpreting or remixing these two paintings, and also wanting to be a little ambiguous. I took the approach of focusing on this idea of a vessel, and that also somewhat making it anthropomorphic, and also sort of blending it with other stories from history, whether Jonah and the Whale or the River Styx. This sort of creature or this vessel that sort of is transporting someone, whether or not it's good or bad, is a little ambiguous. Because as I'm maturing as an artist, I've gotten away from trying to assign specific meanings to every action I make in an artwork. While definitely there are decisions that are thought out in terms of, but for the viewer, I don't want to spell out every intention. And I almost feel like maybe Homer's doing that a little bit as well, and that, you know, in the end, that makes it a richer artwork, and that there's ways that it can, you know, be timeless and, you know, be open for interpretation, you know, in the time it was painted and afterwards, like us having this whole conversation. And that it doesn't mean one thing, but, you know, the contemporary context can add, you know, expand ways of sort of interpreting it, and how we look at ourselves and the time around us. And um, I think both paintings, as well as my work, still are sort of in dialogue with each other, even though they sort of address the topics differently. And if we move through the sort of different images, so this is the study model, one of the early study model for the Gulfstream piece that I ended up realizing, which is essentially looking at sort of the vessel as a sort of a creature that is, you know, for transporting a person. In this case, it's sort of as if it's washed ashore. Well, if how it would look if it was intact, but the sort of the skeletal system holding it together. And if we go into some of the other images, I started looking at, you know, what if, you know, the boat or this creature or the vessel, you know, had washed ashore, and sort of with the image on the bottom right, you know, specifically sort of thinking about the boat that is in the Gulfstream painting of Homer, and sort of also the painting after the hurricane, you know, by Homer as well. What if this sort of our protagonist made it back to shore? Like, hopefully he lived, but in the final realization of the piece, it's not clear. Where are the contents? I don't want to say cargo, but it's open ended. If this like vessel is, how to say, if it has a positive or negative sort of meaning, and but also in the realized sculpture, it's very open ended in terms of people can approach this just as an artwork that is completely honky dory in terms of. It's a boat that is sort of surreal, that as you approach it, it just looks like a boat, but as you get closer, you know, it reveals this sort of whale-like skeleton on the inside. But of course, you know, especially in this context of this conversation, it can have a much more expanded notion of what a vessel is as this sort of thing that transports both goods and people over water, and sort of the long history of how these sorts of vessels have been used to transport people and things, you know, for both good and bad reasons. You know, in this case, the vessel is somewhat like washed ashore. Is it a beached whale, or has someone docked it as the tide has gone out? For me, it's a little open ended, but also, you know, it's hopefully more universal in that while the issues in Homer's painting are like sort of dealing with a black figure, I wanted to expand the sort of audience that, you know, this sculpture in Brooklyn Bridge Park is approached by many people who have no idea who I am in terms of making it as an artist, as well as, you know, this wider dialogue of what it could be about. And so it has a really expanded potential meanings, but it excites me that someone might just be attracted to it for what it is as this artwork. And when they actually, find out more about it, they've widened their purview of what an artwork can be about. That it while it is this sort of beautiful thing, it can have a much more complex meaning that expands to their own personal histories.
Yeah, I did see photos of children climbing in it and playing on it, which I thought also brought another really kind of profound layer of meaning to the work of art. And again, speaking to these kind of multivalent ways of seeing it or interpreting it, I think is really important. And I love your kind of echoes of Homer's deliberate ambiguity and different meanings in these works. I wanted to go back to Ada for a minute and thinking about I mean, do you see in Homer's art, these two paintings in particular, a kind of contemporary relevance to Cuba and Cuban history? I mean, is there, what would you see as points of contact with the current moment, if any?
One, I guess, is that, when I look at the Gulfstream painting, when you see all these things that seem to be timeless or transhistorical over centuries, like the sugar cane or the references possibly to the slave trade, I feel like I look at the man, not just at the ship or the storm or the ship in the distance, but the man sitting on the ship, and try to figure out what he's thinking or what's going through his mind in that moment. And of course, I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know what Homer would have said to that. But I almost feel like there's a way in which there's a continuity of all these world historical forces, the slave trade, colonialism, and it feels like no matter the moment, this is maybe a very much less hopeful interpretation than the one Hugh was started out with. But you see the man as kind of always having to face those world historical forces from this position of uncertainty. So, and I think that certainly resonates now. I guess the other resonance is that, in the 19th century, everyone understood that U.S. policy, the U.S. as it was becoming more powerful, would have an impact on what was unfolding in Cuba and the Caribbean. And I feel like that is definitely the case now. The U.S. foreign policy in the region and U.S. policy regarding the Caribbean and Latin America politically in terms of climate change, all these things, what the U.S. does has enormous impact. But I'm not sure that the average American today is as aware of the potential negative impacts of U.S. power as they would have been.
I'm struck also by thinking about the Gulfstream painting and hearing you all speak today about different types of migration and movement between the United States and the Bahamas, between the United States and Cuba, and how really, to Ada's point, interconnected these places, these histories, these economies are. And I think of the different types of movements of humans, the trafficking of enslaved people, or different kinds of migration, and how that resonates today, and some of the threats of nature in that process, like the protagonist in the Gulfstream. We think of people still continuing to move between Cuba and the U.S. or between the Bahamas and the U.S. And that's another way that I've sometimes see this contemporary relevance. And I know, Bernard, that's something that you've thought about also.
From the literature that I've been able to engage with, as I think about this painting, about the Gulfstream, from the literature that I've been able to engage with, there's a kind of like elusive quality that seems to be, that people seem to kind of be struck with when they engage with it. Like, what is the kind of concrete thing that Homer might be intending? What is the meaning of the painting? And when I engage with Bahamians, when I've asked a few Bahamians about this painting in the past month or so, to me and to them, it's very, like, it feels very clear. There's no elusiveness at all. This is so clearly about us, and we see ourselves to the point of pain, to the point of a kind of like, this painting's like triggering to us. If we think about the destruction from the worsening storms, and specifically from recently 2019 Hurricane Dorian, where many Bahamians died, and many Bahamians are still suffering from the impacts of that storm. There was a shift that happened in our psyche when it comes to storms. We kind of, I think what Homer kind of gets right in the Gulfstream with the protagonist and the kind of posture of the protagonist, the kind of, it seems disconnected, but I think, or there seems to be a helplessness, but I think it's more so a surrender. You've done all you can, and you have to surrender there's a faith involved in that. There's a rigorous faith involved in that, and I think Homer gets that right. But that kind of psyche, that kind of like approach to the storms and to the damage possible in the storms, that kind of approach to our location as Bahamians, moving through the world, moving. I mean, you can also see that like the ship as an island, right? That the man on that ship, that ship is quite literally you can see it as an island. So the context of the Bahamas and how we continue to try to forge an existence as a country, you could see there's a shift that happens in our psyche that has happened because of this hurricane, and that is happening because of the crisis, where it's not surrender anymore. It's kind of despair. It's kind of terror. So when I talk to family, when I talk to friends, Bahamian friends about this painting now, it's a kind of like it's there's a flinch, and I don't think that flinch was there before. It's quite literally because of these new contexts, the aftermath of these like really intense natural disasters. Again, that is being made worse by the derivatives of colonization and the derivatives of slavery. These storms being worsened. It shifts our ability to consider survival. It shifts our hope quite a bit. And so looking at this, I think this painting, this multivalence throughout time. I don't think Homer was necessarily thinking about the climate crisis. He couldn't have been back then. But it's amazing how it kind of stands the test of time in that way. So much so, I think something maybe worth mentioning here is a way that I'm coming to approach this painting, a way that I'm coming to name my fascination with it. So Dr. Ayanna Johnson, she's a marine biologist that but collated this like anthology, All We Can Save. And she's trying to approach the climate crisis with hope. She's an American. I'm trying to approach the climate crisis with hope. And she says, what we're in is a moment of climate renaissance, right? And so we have to have a renewed attention to the kind of wisdom and knowledge, the kind of knowledge production, the kind of art, the kind of ways we think about society, the ways we have been as humans. We have to have a revival that allows us to shift. And so what she argues for is looking at what we have already with new eyes. And I think that's exactly what Homer provides, this painting, the Gulfstream provides. If you look at it through the eyes of climate and it holds up, it gives you an opportunity to further understand the crisis through a different kind of lens. This is where we're at as Bahamians. It aptly captures that. And so I have some questions about like, if people outside of the context of like small island states, if they were to look at this painting, and I tell them, or if you were to say, hey, this is about the climate crisis, does that provide some sort of openings to try to understand the crisis as it is? Does that help expand what folks might understand is at risk, what the dynamics of the crisis is?
Oh, Bernard, how do you feel react to after the hurricane watercolor? Is it optimistic? I mean, because of course in it you actually don't know if he's alive, but in terms of it is relatively hopeful if it's, or do we know if it came after the Gulfstream, or technically, or what came first?
It was probably before the Gulfstream, but I do think Homer was kind of stringing these narratives across the paintings. So, yeah.
I feel deep pain. I feel like it's just there's doing the research into the book that I'm writing and the kind of work that I'm committed to is remembering Dorian and unpacking the thick context, like the amount of context that Dorian kind of like plowed through, the significance of it, and using that to understand climate. There's so many images of Bahamians kind of in this pose. Like there isn't a ship involved, but there is this sense of shipwreckness. There is this sense of they're in the aftermath of the storm. The kind of visuals that I have to engage with, the kind of visuals that are stuck and present in the mind of Bahamians right now. I approach this with dread. I see this as not hopeful at at all. Even if this person survived, they are wounded. They've been through this like incredible trauma of a shipwreck. And so yeah, I don't kind of strung throughout the narrative of the watercolors, and the kind of like climax of the Gulfstream, the main this oil color. I I don't see much. I don't feel much hope myself. I see a kind of like reading of the situation as precarious as it is. I do wish for hope, but I don't know. I think given Homer's position, as a white, quite privileged and resourced person moving through these through the Bahamian Islands when he did, I don't think he was able to necessarily engage as richly with like the Bahamian psyche. So there's not much attention, there's not much care afforded to the bodies in his paintings, which I think is a fair criticism, but also like I don't like, given his position at the time and as he was moving through the Bahamas, that seems about right. But yeah, so looking back with that lens, I think there's something that was missing on Homer's side. There was not much. I don't think he offered much hope, to be honest. I don't think that. Ada, you mentioned this before of the ship on the horizon not indicating hope. That I think that's also like a failure of like Homer's like reading of like, oh, this means hope. Well, not really, actually. And so there's a little bit of like a block between Homer and the psyche of these subjects when he's in the Bahamas.
Well, I would add that, and I'm not trying to defend Homer, but at the same time he adds the boat on the horizon, he actually heightens the storm and makes the storm worse, and he adds damage to the boat. So again, there's this tension here, right, where he's, kind of being snarky towards the people who are inquiring. And I do believe that he wanted us to be challenged by the painting and be in this uncomfortable spot. So as he adds the boat, he also makes the storm worse. He makes, so he's heightening the threat as well. And I think you bring up another important point, which is that he is very much a privileged tourist visiting this island, staying in a luxury hotel. And though he becomes interested in the lives of the Bahamians, he is, not showing us directly in his work the privileged world he's participating in. So thank you for bringing that in.
I'm just wondering what the two of you made of the figure on the boat. I mean, how do you read his posture and his glance? He doesn't seem like he's someone, he doesn't seem ready to battle a storm. He doesn't seem like he's about to battle a storm, right? I mean, is it this pose of surrender, Bernard, that you mentioned? Is he already mourning for the other person on the boat who already suffered a shark attack? I mean, I just keep coming back to the figure, and and just wondering how you two read it.
Relatively relaxed for like, and he's muscular, but given the scenario, he's somewhat like, I wouldn't say optimistic, but more nonchalant, or but he's also thinking too and pensive, and sort of like if he's in this peril, like it's sort of like he's like, I don't know if it's contemplative is the right word, but sort of it's sort of he's in this situation, but at the same time he looks relaxed, or he's like, contemplating his next move.
My deep fascination with this painting comes from this figure, I think. I think there's a little bit of a dearth of engagement, like rigorous engagement with the figure in terms of like the kind of literature that is around this painting. There's so little that actually engages with the psychology that might be going on behind or inside of this figure. I read it. I mean, I've mentioned how I see it like as there's a shift in current Bahamian psyche where this kind of posture doesn't exist anymore, I think. But when it did exist, before this kind of like context of the climate crisis and worsening storms, what I see in this posture is a kind of, excuse my language, but it's like, oh, this is more of the same shit. Like, this is not new. Like, the way I'm literally mastless and rudderless, and surrounded by sharks and in a storm is not very different than what I have been subjected to. And so what I see here's what I see in my family. When I talk to them about the crisis, when we talk about storms, there's a kind of like, yeah, the storms are going to get worse, but right now we have what we need. And I see that in the psychology of what I could kind of like project that psychology onto this protagonist. Like there is a drink. I mean, what I interpret as a drink in his hand. There is a kind of like the ship is upright. The ship is not sinking. The ship is just rudderless. The storm will pass. So
But
go on.
but also, given how like rough the sea is, he's not like gripping or like,
Yeah,
if you're out of rough, he's actually like, you could say, I don't know how to, he's like riding the horse. He's like, while he's not in control, he isn't like acting as if he's in peril. Like it's like he's like almost like used to being in a tough situation, and he can effortlessly like ride the boat, even though it part of the boat is out of the water and there's these huge waves. He's actually like not afraid, almost stoic, and like has like that kind of a look on his face, so that while it is like a very tough scenario and scene to be in and challenging, it's almost like he's unfortunately like a lot of black people say, kind of used to this.
like he's riding it out. He's riding that. He's like, I just got to ride the storm out. I don't know if anybody has readings on why he's looking to the right. Like why that direction. I mean, the worsening storm is also like positioned toward that direction. That's if we think about to me that looks backward. Like the mast of the ship is like going the front of the ship is going in a different direction than when he's looking. So I'm like, is he looking back on history? Is he looking back on like what does this represent? This particular direction by which Homer directed his gaze. Not even interested in us, not even giving us his like not giving us a direct look at his face, but like this super disinterested, something more important is happening outside of the painting.
And not looking at the so-called rescue ship either, right? So I mean, it's just, I think it's fascinating. I mean, I had that same sense that it's this feeling that it's one thing after another, and first it was conquest, it was slavery, it was this, it was that, now it's climate change. But thinking about when Homer was working on it, so if he started it, I mean, he worked on this earlier and then went back, right? He did it in 1902 and then worked on it till 1899, then worked on it till 1906. Yeah. That it might also, I mean, one of the things that might also have felt the same would have been U.S. empire, that the U.S. established, went out into this region in this, massively different way at the turn of the 20th century, using the language of freedom and all that. And then, empire is empire.
It's funny in this, you kind of made me think of this as a meme in a way where you could put like text what the storm is, like, police, different things on the ship, like to categorize, the potential help, the storm, the sharks, the sugarcane, the broken mast. Like there's a way that you could like memify this painting to represent like a more contemporary context. I mean, I love that it has so many ambiguities and like things that are opposites or that sort of don't necessarily, I mean, that's what makes it ambiguous. And as an artist, that's something a lot of my work deals with in a way to describe the American dream, that it's, trying to inhabit a difficult space that can, offer things that are enjoyable, but at the same time be very difficult and unhospitable.
I think just to add, Stephanie, you mentioned the question of migration before, and I hadn't thought about it till you mentioned it, but it's so clear and obvious in a way that it's so much a part of the Caribbean Sea over the last many decades, and that this is what hundreds of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Caribbeans have dealt with and have seen people succumb to shark attacks and things. So it's another another major historical force that wouldn't, that has contemporary resonance in a way.
Clearly a Bahamian type vessel that was kind of traditional to the Bahamas. As Bernard's, you see this figure strongly as a Bahamian, and yet Homer makes the boat's port Florida, Key West. So thinking about how many Bahamians traveled between the Bahamas and Key West, but also in that way that it also becomes a kind of metaphor for the United States or the ship of state, and kind of going back to some of the bigger political implications. And I think there's this sense of the painting where we can just kind of go around and around to all of these different issues, and it still remains out of reach in so many ways. And that's kind of what keeps us talking about it. Any final thoughts you'd all like to share as we end our time together?
No, this has been a great conversation. I've looked at the painting in a new way to some degree, but also just sort of, again, like the protagonist here, that he was sort of potentially like sailing his own boat and like finding his own way, but his agency was stripped away by this sort of surrounding moment, and that he's once again at sort of the mercy of these greater systems, but he's sort of like complacent with it, or sort of riding it out.
And Hugh and Bernard have both mentioned to me that Homer and his work may be inspiring your efforts now. And as we close, do you want to say anything about that?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, yeah, as I've already mentioned, that and specifically the piece that I have at Brooklyn Bridge Park right now, that is essentially named after, titled after this work, also called the Gulfstream, is sort of taking this historical painting as well as Kerry James Marshall's, and providing a different lens to sort of look at a different at the same topic, and sort of, but also expand it where it's not necessarily only about this sort of the legacies of the transatlantic sort of slave trade, but just larger narratives that can be about these specific issues, but also larger issues too. Because this painting, I feel like it will center sort of this sort of Black man in peril. I mean, that is in this painting. And for myself as an artist, though, I think it's important to, or at least what I try to make my view of the world accessible to other people, so that I can open up their minds to sort of a new perspective, ideally. Sometimes it's more optimistic and sometimes less so.
Bernard, did you want to add anything about your coming work?
This painting kind of like appears right on time for me, and being able to like think about this painting and then share some thinking and be in conversation with all of you is really on time for me, because so last year, maybe around this exact same time, I was back home doing some in-depth research into the aftermath of Dorian, and there are people still like struggling, really intense, debilitating struggle, and I also like almost lost my mother in the storm, and so I was holding all of this while encountering the kind of damage that still is persistent in the landscape, like the natural landscape. It's going to take like decades for a natural landscape to kind of bounce back from the kind of damage that we've seen. And I am a poet, so I'm like aware of like colonization, and it's like the way history can like is coming to play a role in the present. And I was on assignment there writing an essay, and I was trying to come up with the language to kind of address all of this in writing, but it felt impossible. Like I was having panic attacks. I was having breakdowns. It felt like, I know it now, like I encountered a kind of trauma. I don't know who said this, but someone said like the brain uses, I don't know if this is true, but the brain uses most of its faculty in language, right? And so something was happening inside of mine where I could not come up with the language to describe the kind of thing that my body was holding. This long history, the effects of it in the present. And so I've been struggling with language for the past year after this encounter. But I look at this painting and I'm like, oh, everything's right there. Somehow, I don't know how, but literally the thing that I was trying to describe, it's here in this image. All of the dynamics are well calibrated. It's well tuned. It's almost as if it was on purpose. It's also called the Gulfstream, right? And the actors in the Gulfstream, the U.S., the Caribbean, the U.K. or Europe. One is a colonizing force. One is a force that is pumping the most greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. One is being most subjected to the effects of that as island states. So the dynamics of this painting really provides me a kind of way to figure out more language. It's like a doorway that I've been able to walk into. And yeah, I'm thinking maybe I'll write some move through some writing about it that uses the paint as the painting as a doorway to talk about like language and trauma and the kind of climate trauma that's happening on small island states. So yeah, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to think alongside all of you, and to kind of just meditate on the painting and see what stirred. It was absolutely this kind of like spark, this doorway opening, in a way that I really needed it.
I hope you don't mind me saying, I was struck in our conversations, and you'll remember that when we were talking about Homer's painting of the Gulfstream, a couple of times you referred to it as a poem, and and in the way that it is this kind of epic saga. So I, for one, look forward to seeing what comes out of this for you, and also to you, Hugh. And Ada, thank you for the gift that is this book, which I've enjoyed so much and I've learned so much from. And I think we've all learned so much from the three of you today. And I'm really grateful for you speaking with us all and sharing this time and space with us to discuss your work. And thank you very, very much.